Yes, my friends, here we are, another episode of the Tyler Hill podcast. This is one of those episodes I'm so excited about because it's one of those where one of my friends introduces me to someone I haven't quite met yet, haven't had big conversations, and so everything today is going to be fresh. Y'all might remember Cameron Johnson. He made videos for my virtual summit on belovedness. He was also a guest on the podcast a few months ago. Probably one of the most practical and insightful podcasts we've ever had in terms of wisdom that can practically be applied to our life. Cameron was just the best. And so after that, I said, hey, who else should I interview? And then Cameron said, remember that guy I talked to you about hip hop and contemplation and meditation? You should bring him on. And so here we are with Josué Perea here on the Tyler Hill podcast. Welcome, Josué.
Thank you so much, Tyler. It's an honor to be here. Like you said, Cameron spoke really highly of you, and like I told you even last night, Cameron was like, "Oh, that's so dope that you're gonna do that." And so I'm glad to connect and learn. And from what I've read about the podcast and also the work that you do is really important work, and I'm thankful to be linked to that. So
Thank you. Well, before we get into all the good work, we are so much more than what we teach. We're so much more than what we put out on the internet. So help me understand just a little bit about you. Let's say you had a couple extra $100. You had a nice weekend to yourself. What are you doing with a little bit of free time just to bring yourself a little bit of joy, a little bit of fun? What are you doing with the time you have? If you had a little money, had a little time, what brings you life
hmm.
in that way?
If I had a little bit of extra money, then I would, and some time. One of the things that really brings me life is watching live jazz,
Mm.
specifically. So I usually go to like some, whatever jazz. New York has a lot of jazz, but I'm in Brooklyn. New York has a lot of jazz spots, but maybe I pay for like one of the front row seats in one like Blue Note or something like that.
Uh,
Watch someone I really like, you know, have a drink or two or just chill with people there. That would be one thing. Another thing would probably be with something that I do regularly, would go to like a monastery just to rest. So it depends on the vibes that I was in. Like what do I need at that moment? If I needed to watch art to be inspired, I'd probably do something like go to Blue Note, go to Village Vanguard, go to one of these places that sometimes I don't go to because they sometimes it's like, oh, that's really expensive to go to that show. Although I try to get to jazz every so often. But if I had some extra money and I was like, oh, I could just do that for whatever, yeah, then we're going to jazz at Lincoln Center, one of the front row seats at Rose Theater, or they have this beautiful room called the Appel Room, and listen to some jazz up front. That would be that. That's what comes to mind right now. So
so
clearly,
good.
that's something that I want to do right now.
Yeah, come on, let's make it happen. Is jazz like the true love when it comes to art and music for you? Is that kind of the thing that moves you deeply? Let us into a little bit of what inspires you, makes you you as an artist, as a creative and all of that. That
I
sounds
think
awesome.
jazz, I think music overall, like in very broad range of music overall, does that. I think the reason why maybe right now I'm thinking of jazz is because I've been thinking about just, I've been listening to some jazz. There's a friend of mine, Julian Davis Reed, who's a jazz artist. He has a ministry called Notes of Rest. His ministry is about music and how Black music can invite us into a contemplative life. And I think jazz animates this not new, but this part of myself that turns to lean toward the creative, but also is very reflective. And I just had a very reflective time where I was working with some jazz. Specifically, I was listening to this artist named Robert Glasper. He did this album called Cold Derivation, which is basically one pure jazz track, and then the same track remixed in a hip hop style.
Mm.
So it would be like, so it's basically you get two tracks for one, and one of them is the pure jazz track, and one of them is the, let's say they remix it, they mix it, and some hip hop guy will remix it, some hip hop DJ. And so I think that I love that because that's kind of like the way my mind thinks sometimes, specifically with jazz and hip hop, like they're very related genres. But jazz does animate a lot of I think my creativity. I think it also animates, to be honest with you, a reflective, but also a very I know we're going to talk about contemplation and meditation, but a contemplative stance that then makes me think of where do I need to move or how do I need to move next.
Mhm.
So that's why I guess that's why I'm thinking about jazz right at this moment.
Yeah, before we dive too far into it, and we'll get deep into it. For you, how would you define or talk about contemplation? Just to give us a little bit of baseline of your kind of lens through that. You already mentioned it brings you to a place of reflection. Obviously, we talk a lot about the contemplative life here, but how would you define that? How would you speak into that as you see it, Josue?
Yeah, so a little bit about that before I say that. Just I'm part of a new monastic community called the Community of the Incarnation. A new monastic community is a community that chooses to live a rule of life, that chooses to have an intentionality. So we're a contemplative community that has takes vows that we choose to live into this life. And the way that I would say we broadly define contemplation at the community, and it's the definition that I use personally, is contemplation is a way for us to make conscious contact with God. So how are we making conscious contact with the divine in our everyday lives? And so the rule of life that we follow, the different contemplative practices that we encourage the different members of the community to practice, all are supposed to create this conscious contact with God. So I broadly define contemplation like that. It may be rooted in, we always say that all contemplative practices have silence as a root, and silence is an important aspect of it, but it doesn't have to be exclusively silent to be contemplative, which I think is sometimes a dichotomy that people draw, like, oh, if there's sound, therefore it is not contemplative. If it's purely silent, then it is contemplative. But we always say, no, no, that's one aspect of contemplation. Silence undergirds all contemplative practice, but it doesn't mean that anything that has sound or music or speech or anything means that it is not contemplative. So that's how I would broadly define contemplation. And I think we find contemplative life in different ways, right? The way that we engage with art, the way that we engage with music, the way that even one of our community members wrote something about cinema divina, the way that we might watch a movie to hear what messages God is telling us for. So I think there's a lot of ways to engage in the contemplative life. And that's what we try to do. And that's what we broadly define it as conscious contact with God.
I love that. Um, tell us now, that gives us enough to talk about outside of my notes already. Oh my gosh. Tell us a little bit about your rule of life. And a lot of my audience will like I'm an oblate at a Benedictine monastery, so we talk a lot about
Oh.
rule, have the rule of Benedict as part of my daily work. So could you describe a little bit, Josue, maybe what a rule of life is? And then I would love to hear some of the elements of your community's rule, as it might also be able to assist any of my listeners in their pursuit of wholeness and a rich life.
Yeah, for sure. I think a rule of life, broadly defined, is something that, again, I'm going to use the word undergirds again, that undergirds our daily rhythms, and that gives us a return back to our true center, or how we're terming, to our deep inner life. So for example, in our community, the rule of life that we um practice, so the community is called the Community of the Incarnation. I don't know if I mentioned the name. It's called the Community of the Incarnation. The Community of the Incarnation is the new monastic community that runs the Center for Spiritual Imagination. The Center for Spiritual Imagination holds different classes on contemplation, on meditation, different ways to engage with the contemplative life. But it's run by members of the community, so all of us. And we have a 3-year formation cycle. So it's not just like I sign up an email thing and I'm in it. No, it's a 3-year formation cycle. There's one, it's actually technically four, because there's a year of postulancy. You're postulating for 1 year, you're learning, you're engaging with different things. And then each of the years we learn of a different contemplative tradition. The first year we learn, just like you said, that you read the rule of Benedict. The first year we engage in Benedictine spirituality. So we steep ourselves deeply in the rule of Benedict and Benedictine spirituality to start to understand the way that we need to combine work and faith in our prayer practices together. The second year, we engage in Carmelite spirituality, and we learn a lot about, because Carmelite spirituality, in many respects, is really about opening up ourselves to the mystery of the divine.
Hmm.
And Carmelite spirituality, if you've ever been at a Carmelite priory, really deeply steeped in contemplative life. Like that's their main thing. And then the last one, the last year's Franciscan spirituality. How can we take both? Now we've learned about the mystery, engaging with the mystery of the divine. We've learned about how to make sure that we're including our rhythm of life into our work life and balancing all of it out. Because we're a new monastic community, people are out, we're not monks in a monastery. We're also a displaced community, right? We're all over the country, actually in between the US and Canada. So the Franciscan charism really helps us learn how do we integrate contemplation and action and to respond to what we say the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. How are we responding to that from a contemplative center? And so for us, the rule of life that we practice is 2 times of contemplative prayer a day. We have a method of prayer called the incarnation method of prayer, which is slowly making the rounds, and some people are slowly hearing about it more. We're a new community. We're only about to turn 6 years old as a community overall, and so if it takes 4 years for formation, then that's why now some of us are just like outside talking about different things. But we have our a prayer method that we use called the incarnation method of prayer. So we recommend 2 times of contemplative prayer a day, 1 time of Lectio Divina a day, can happen whenever. Um, 2 offices a day, so whichever offices you want to do. Offices, obviously, prayer times. Many people do a morning office, an evening office. Some of us do a midday office, and then a daily examine at the end of the day. So this is the daily rhythm of life. But then we have some yearly things that we recommend. We recommend everyone to have part of the rule is to have a spiritual director. Part of the rule is to have a therapist, some sort of licensed therapist, as you can afford both of those, obviously. Part of the rule is also to take 1 week of retreat just for you to have yourself some time. And then part of the rule is to have a monthly desert day, a day where you are unplugged from society for minimum, I think we try to say minimum 6 hours, minimum half a day, where you may be fasting, maybe not fasting, but you're just connecting with yourself and with God and practicing desert day. Some other Christian traditions call it pustinia, and so that's kind of the rule overall. And we slowly introduce the rule to people who are interested in joining the community, especially joining the vowed community,
Yeah.
because we have 3 different ways to engage with the community. You can engage with the community in the vowed path, which is like the path that I'm on, which I took vows. I'm willing to commit to this rule of life for life. There's also an exploring path. You're like, I kind of want to maybe see what it is. And then we have a companion path. Our companion path, I mentioned only because it's really similar to the oblate path
Hmm.
that you're on. Um, that's for someone who's like, you know what, I don't know if I could do that whole thing, but I do want to at least be a companion to the community. And out of respect to the tradition, we're not going to call it oblates because they're not. It's a different role, but it's similar
Mm.
in that we look at a lot of oblate programs for what we're doing with the companion way. And so that's kind of the thing. And we introduce the rule little by little as people are coming along. It's like, hey, just try this, so that because it feels like a lot when I say it to people, like they're like, oh my God, that's a lot. But when you introduce it little by little, then the rhythms are actually really easy to manage.
Yeah.
Like it's really easy for me to always do a morning office and a morning contemplative time. Not a problem. I also really love to do an examine, so I do the examine all the time, every evening, without a problem. I may miss another office here or there,
Yeah.
but it's not so difficult, except when you hear it up front, then it becomes a lot. So
Yeah.
that's a rule of life, and I think that the rule of life is just like I said, it undergirds ourselves. It does bring us back. I think one of the beauty things that we always tell people about establishing a rule of life is that it's a way to always have something that returns you, right? So sometimes when I personally feel off center, I realize like, oh wait, man, you know what? I skipped that time today. You know
Yeah.
what? No wonder I felt a little off center. And it's interesting because the busier that I am, and I'm not trying to say a comment on using contemplative life for productivity. But the busier that I am, whenever I am the busiest, and I say that I don't have time, is when I actually need to create more time for contemplation. And I think it works like that. So that's kind of a little bit of the rule and a little bit of the way that we introduced the rule throughout the years. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it's not it doesn't make you more productive. Like that's not the goal. But the truth is it does help you bear fruit in your life.
I
So,
think it
I
just
mean,
helps you create a really good balance.
yes.
So like, so that's why I didn't want to couch it, because one time I said this somewhere and someone was like, "So you're saying it makes me more productive?" I'm like, "I'm not trying to get you to be more productive.
Yep.
I actually just want you to create balance," right? Howard Thurman talks about developing our deep inner life in order for us to withstand everything that's happening in the world.
Yes.
And I really believe that. Like, yes, because it's helped me withstand everything that's happening in the world, everything that's happening in my life. So yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, it's like just like while we do live in a world where production and overwork harms us so deeply, bearing good fruit and making beautiful things, working well, and this is very Benedictine of me, to pray and to work is part of the game. And so,
Yeah.
like I actually probably don't even have a problem saying it does make us more productive. Production is not the end goal. It does not make us more loved. And yet, living healthy, living rooted, living balanced, we become the fullest expression of us, which does cultivate beauty in the world. And good things do come from us when we do that, and it really is a true byproduct. Like nobody's mad at a vine for producing fruit. I tell you that. Um,
No, I think I just think about it in the way, I'll just a quick comment. I agree with you. I don't necessarily think that that's a thing. I just want to make sure that people are unattaching, because there's been a lot of reading that I'm doing lately. We're doing a course coming up at some point called Socially Engaged Mysticism. And what we're reading though is that there's a big trend, and I'm sure you noticed it, that there's this co-option of mindfulness slash meditation slash contemplation as a tool to be more productive, and therefore continue to keep the same kind of structure of overwork and overtiredness, right? So I think I'm always just making sure that people understand that we believe in the deep inner life, for us to
yes,
be free, for us to produce freely and openly, but not for us to be, agents of the machine, let's say, to be like, go do more work and produce more and do more. Because you're right, divine produces at its own rate. What, the system wants us to do is to not produce at its own rate, to produce more than it's naturally capable. And I think, and I just been reading some stuff about that. Like, there was some guy who I just read an article. Like, he was like a business guy, and he went and found mindfulness, but immediately turned it into an enterprise that he wanted to do. It's like, okay, maybe that was your calling or whatever. Is that what it's about? And I think that sometimes things can become co-opted. But I agree with you. As long as we're creating from a deep center, and we're creating freely and openly, and we're responding to the call of the divine, however we want to call that in our lives, that I think is really significant, because then we create openly, right? What Saint Irenaeus of Leon said: the glory of God is for people to for the human being to be fully alive, right? And that is that. And I pair that with Thurman. Thurman says, what the world needs is for people to do what really brings life in them. I forget the exact quote, brings
yep.
fire into them, and go in the world and do that. So as long as the contemplative life is doing that, that's great.
Mhm.
As long as we're not co-opting it to be like,
Yes,
go be more productive at work, because help this machine run,
yes,
you know.
yep. You spoke into this just a touch, but I'd love to maybe just dive into this a little more. Yeah, on the front end, a rule of life sounds so burdensome. And like you said, okay, but when you gradually ease into it, it really is liberating for the soul. Um, but for somebody who's not considered a rule of life, who thinks, oh man, like you contemplatives always talk about not being so religious. And holy cow, Josue, like that sounds more religious than anything I ever did at my Baptist church. Like, what the heck? Could you just even deepen that just a little more
You
to
know,
speak into that?
it's funny that you say that, because I've had this conversation with friends when they're when because I actually don't use the word that I'm religious anymore
Hmm.
because people misunderstand what that means. I am very religious, but
Yep.
I say, "Oh, I'm devout," and they're like, "What does that mean? What does devout mean?" And I'm like, "Well, devout just means that it's something that I really commit to, and that I'm committed to this." Right? I actually was just listening to something about the way Jungian analysts look at something that marries ambition with contentment, and they were saying that devotion is that thing. These analysts were saying devotion and being devout actually marries this whole idea of ambition, of wanting to do more and more and more, and contentment, of being like, I'm content, because devotion lets you go deeper into one thing. You're like, I'm devoted to this, and therefore this is the thing that I'm going to do. I think that the way that we talk about a rule of life, and the way that a rule of life, I always start by saying everyone has a rule of life. That you don't know what that rule of life is for you because you may be doing unconsciously is another whole thing, and that you may have, but everyone has rhythms that they do, right? People wake up, immediately maybe turn on the tea or turn on the coffee machine, get ready, do these things, maybe read something, maybe do that, and then the rest of the day starts, right? There's people who have, I think all of us have some sort of rule of life, whether we call it that because it's not conscious or intentional, that's a different thing. So I would say that I think that sometimes I was laughing when you said you contemplatives do, because it is a conversation I've had. Like, you contemplatives say that you're not. I think that it's less about doing it just for the sake of doing it, even though there is a strength in that. So in Benedictine spirituality, as you know really well, you do the offices, you do the 5 or 7, whichever, however, the structure is usually in a Benedictine monastery. And when you talk to monks, they're like, yeah, sometimes I'm not feeling anything in the
Yep.
moment. But it doesn't mean that that moment is not an important moment. It creates the space. This poet that I really love, his name is Hanif Abdul Rakib. He wrote this excellent book called On Basketball and Ascension. There's always this year
It's
on
so good.
basketball. It's
I'm
so good. In
uh,
that book, he has this beginning of a chapter where he says this about prayer. He says, some of us tend to believe that prayer is about answering a prayer, that, and he says some of us tend to believe that. He's like, and if some of us are wishful, we imagine that a prayer gets filed away in some queue and God at some point will get to it. He says, but he says what he learned about prayer is that the reward is the ritual, and in the ritual is the reward. That just creating the space for prayer, creating the moment for prayer, that creates the reward. And I'll tell you, I did my part of the rule this morning. In the meditation that I did this morning, I don't know if I felt anything, but in the lecture this morning spoke to me a lot. Last night, the examine spoke, like that moment that I had where I was evaluating my day, really created me to go back and to look at my day, and really actually filled me with energy, actually, like at 9 p.m. And I was like, I don't need to have energy, but he just gave me a reference point. I think that what we do when we create these rules of life, or these rooms for the divine, I think that's what we're doing. We're creating space for the divine to come into our lives, to be reminded of the divine, right? In the examine, we regularly say the first movement of the examine after you center your breath is, where has God been present for you? Or how has the divine been present for you? And taking a moment just to think about that is rich enough in itself. That is doesn't mean that I have to do it because I feel like I need to do it, because, or else, the bully God, or however I interpret the divine, is going to come punish me. That's where I think the difference is. We do this out of love, out of a surplus of love and wanting to connect, not out of a sense of like, I need to do it or else something bad is going to happen to me. So when I talk about devoutness or religiosity, that's usually kind of the framework that I use.
Yep.
The idea that things are done out of your own will and wanting to do that and wanting to connect, versus in a religious setting, sometimes it's done out of like this demand that I have to do it. And if I don't do it, then something bad is going to happen to me. No one in our community, we don't have a community chat where people are like, did you do your prayers of today? No one's checking on that. It's your own commitment. But I think that everyone can notice when they don't do it, how they feel versus when they do it. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tyler, but I think that that's an important distinction there, right? Like,
Yeah.
this willingness to do it out of out of an abundance of love, let's say, out of an abundance of desire versus a requirement, right? Those are two different things, right? When we do that.
Yeah, it makes me think of you know, like football season is starting right now, which for me actually means soccer season has started, but it goes
Hey,
hand in
I'm
hand.
glad you said that.
Yeah.
I watch more soccer than I watch football.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry.
love that. But like there are major rituals that surround every event, whether it's a Saturday or Sunday morning, and the clothes we wear, and in soccer, the songs we sing, and those are rituals done out of great devotion, great adoration for, whatever team you might follow, and yet no one would articulate that as a burdensome religious practice. While it really, I mean, there are times, there are songs, there are vestment, it's all part of it, done from a place of pure love, joy, and adoration, and it doesn't get confused with that type of religious sort of boxing that we so often rebel against these days, and I think
And
it
I
makes
and
perfect sense.
yeah, and I think to be honest, I understand why we're doing that, especially in our country, especially those people who grew up maybe in a American Christianity is so interesting because American Christianity, depending on the denomination, is has always had this real impact of this steep religiosity, right? Like you have to do these things because this is what the way that we do it. So obviously evangelicalism has that. I grew up in a Pentecostal church that had that. But sometimes there's this missing portion of like, do you do it because you want to do it, not because you have to do it? And I remember growing up in the Pentecostal church, like eventually you're supposed to turn that, but I don't think the American church guides people into how to change into a you do it because you have to do it to you want to do it, which is why statistics show, like all the statistics from Barna and all those research places that do research on Christianity show like 73% or something like that of kids once they go to college leave the church. Why is that? Because it was just this rigid, you have to do it because you have to do it. Why do you go to church? Because I told you you have to go. So there's no willingness to go, there's no desire. And only so out of 73 that leave, I think only 20 something percent come back. And it's because maybe that 20% found something interesting or found something connecting. The rest 50% are like, nah, I don't have to do it, then I'm not gonna do it. So we've created this idea of this very, responsibility driven Christianity, which is really not the tenet of the faith, but it is the response, the way that we've done it now. So I know that that went into a different place, but I just thought about of that as a part of that dichotomy, right? Why and that's why willingly you and I are now engaged in some sort of rule of life willingly. I don't need someone to check on me to do it. I'm fine. It's something that helps me connect. Whether someone interprets that as religious or not, that's on them. But I feel like it brings me life. It makes me more centered. It makes me more giving, more fruitful, as you said. And I think that's important.
Yeah. One other thing, and then we can move on to some other good stuff here. Whenever something crazy happens, this podcast will come out in a couple weeks, but it's been a crazy week, on the internet, as a lot of weeks are nowadays. Whenever I go to the monastery, the Benedictine monastery that I'm a part of is about 40 minutes from me. And they're so cool, dude. They're like, they're all in their 70s and 80s, and they read the news every day, and they're on their little iPads, and they're very aware. They are very awake to the happenings in the world. And they're never panicked. They're never panicked.
Hmm.
And every time when something crazy happens in politics or society or whatever, and I go there, there's such a stable nature that calms me down and my nervous system just chills out. And I think, and one of the things I think about is that part of the reason they say that they're not panicked is that like the rule of Benedict has been around for 1500 years, which is to say they've seen all of it. Every president, every world war, and they have sustained their community, they have sustained their connection with God, And it all comes down to them having a structured way that allows them to stay plugged in. And I think for them, because they've stayed plugged in for so long, they've been able to see the ups and downs of the world around, the oppressions and the liberations, the joys and the sorrows, all of it. And to me, I'm saying, okay, I need something like that that keeps me stable as it
Mm,
goes up and down. And for me, a rule of life does that in so many ways. And that's why they don't panic. They're not ignorant. They don't hide, but they don't panic. And I think a rule of life really helps us also just not panic. Okay, somebody dies. I still am going to go to prayer at noon, no matter what. And
yeah.
versus I'm going to doom scroll for the next 7 days.
Yeah,
Um,
and just to add to that, I really Howard Thurman says something. He's literally says that he says we need to develop an inner life because he says that the inner life, if we develop a deep inner life, then we have deep roots from when the winds of life come. He says when all these winds of life comes, then we're not taken to and fro by the winds. We stay stable in what he calls the God of our inner life, right? Because in he says within ourselves we find the way that God speaks to us. And I think that's what the monks. That's what I think your experience with the monastery that you're connected with is great because I feel like that with every monastery that I've been to. Like things happen, and they're like, yeah, all right, that happened. We're still going to go to prayer. We still have this thing because they're not moved. They're not so shaken to and fro by the winds of life. They're more stable, and I do think that's what the contemplative life offers us. Contemplation offers us a way to be really grounded to something that's not just doom scrolling, right? Because some people are, that's what grounds them. So then but that's not a real solid ground to use a metaphor, right? That's sand. Or at least loose sand, because you can be rooted in sand, but loose sand. That's not really rooting. And I think what the contemplative life offers, what a rule of life offers, is a grounding beyond that to something much deeper that connects you to the God of your inner life, as Howard Thurman says it.
yeah, so good. Um, you mentioned growing up Pentecostal. How did you get here? We're talking about Howard Thurman. We're talking about Merton and monasteries and all of this. Could you let us into a little bit of that story to becoming a facilitator, being in the new monastic movement here? We're talking about Divina of all kinds. Tell us a little bit of that story.
Yeah. Well, Pentecostalism is actually has some aspects that are deeply contemplative that people don't know.
Mm,
Pentecostalism is a movement began by 1903. Oh my God, I'm forgetting his name right now. Early 1900s in the U.S. Um, uh, he was a black preacher. What is his name? I forget his name. Anyways, connected to the holiness movement and then created this whole thing. And the idea is really speaking in tongues and the physical, really broadly speaking, the physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit, right? Baptism in the Holy Spirit is a big aspect of physical manifestation, right? It's part of the evangelical tree and when you talk about the history of Christianity. And the way that I always say that because Pentecostalism is more contemplative than what people think, is really what allowed and created this idea that is more of the rhythm that I connected with. So, for example, in a Pentecostal church, those people who grew up in Pentecostal circles know that when you come into the church, you're supposed to engage in some silent prayer of some kind on your own. You're supposed to, on your own, either do silent prayer. And if you don't do silent prayer, then you're supposed to read scripture silently, which in non-Pentecostal settings, that's either silent prayer or lectio divina. You're engaged in that. And I remember that I always gravitated more towards that than the bombastic part of Pentecostalism, which does have a really living and bombastic part of it. I never identified with that because I just felt like that wasn't me. And I remember I was a very young preacher. I started preaching at like 10 years old, 11 years old, in the Bronx. And I preached all through. I was a minister at 16 years old, which is crazy. Like, I don't know what an 11-year-old Josué was preaching about and what a 16-year-old Josué was trying to counsel someone. I don't think I ever counseled someone, but what I would have, anyway,
yeah.
16-year-olds too young. But I had known it so much, I could never. And people always say, "Oh, you," and I've read a lot of scripture because, again, you have to go into either silent prayer or read scripture. And I didn't always want to do silent prayer. I did it sometimes, but I always read scripture. It was like, I'll find, then I'll just go read. And I read a bunch of scripture, and it created, I think, this identity of like, okay, I like this rhythm, this kind of silent
Mm,
kind of rhythm, because it did always center me. And so before I would preach or whatever, when I was in the Pentecostal church, I always made sure to do that, to pray and do a lectio, what we would call lectio, on my own. And so that led, I think that created this desire. And so then once I left the Pentecostal church, because long story short, things happened. um, I remember thinking like, well, what is really leading me? And I remember what I did was attend a Benedictine monastery. I
mm,
was going through a crisis of faith. Really, not really faith. To be honest, it was just a personal crisis. Had a bad breakup, someone I was with for a few years. It went poorly. The breakup was actually really horrible. And it made me feel like I didn't have a center. And a friend was like, "Hey, do you want to visit this monastery with me?" And I was like, "Sure, whatever." I'd always thought about visiting a monastery, but I'd never, you know, hit play on it just because I always felt like, when you grew up Pentecostal, you grew up very anti-high church, very anti anything that's not evangelical Christianity, really. I had not grown up like that necessarily, fully speaking, because my dad was a lawyer in addition to being a pastor. And so he was always very critical of like what we're reading, what they're saying, all of that. I
mm,
remember when I was in ministry school, one of the professors told me that I asked too many questions, and I told my dad, and he was like, "You ask all the questions you want. Don't let these people tell you not to ask questions." So I asked all the questions that made me a little bit more critical. So I always had this dubiousness of like, well, what's happening here? and so and so I had always wanted to go, but I never knew the right moment. And I think it was just the right moment at this moment of personal crisis that I felt didn't have a center. And just going to that reminded me of like the silent time of prayers at the church, this time of reading scripture at the church. And like the rhythms of a Benedictine monastery. I was there for 3 days, just kind of grounded me and gave me a center. And I was like, oh, I can do this outside of this. And that's really what led me there, right? Was this crisis, this personal crisis that then led me to do it not just as a way to escape the crisis, but led me to do it as a way to really find myself. And then I really was like, oh, I think this is working. I had tried Buddhist meditation really briefly, in between that period, because I just needed to find a center. And and Buddhist meditation is great. I meditate with people who are in the Buddhist tradition now, but it didn't at that point really wasn't connecting with me. And I think that the Christian contemplative tradition, especially Benedictine spirituality, really connected with me because it was very familiar.
yeah,
Because there were similar rhythms, even though they were called different in very different ways. There were similarities enough between my Pentecostal upbringing and that made me feel more at home, and then allowed me to develop. And then slowly but surely, I kept practicing this rule. Just personal things. I would do one office a day, a period of silence every day. Like I just had these reminders on my phone. Period of gratitude at the end of the day. It was just like little alarms, like do this, and it helped me create my own personal rule. And then I learned about the community when it was starting, and then that's what led me here. So I think that's the brief story of that journey.
mhm,
But there were roots in the Pentecostal church for that, which I always say, like people don't know, but there's contemplative aspects of Pentecostalism. Like when the Spirit in the moment, I don't know if you've ever been to a Pentecostal service, Tyler, but when the Spirit is taking over the room,
mhm,
if you're not the person who the spirit is landing on or possessing or whatever, I don't want to use the word possess because that people identify that negatively, but that is what happens when the spirit is not landing on you. You're supposed to be in a very contemplative prayer space. You're not supposed to be eyes open, watching around. You're supposed to be kind of eyes closed, praying to yourself. And I think all of that created these contemplative kind of markers that then made it easy for me to identify with contemplative Christianity once I started to learn more about that.
yeah. I really appreciate that. I feel like even even for me to hear some of that is illuminating to some degree. And I'm definitely not anti anything really. I'm not anti-Pentecostal church or even evangelicalism all the way. I mean, with all the flaws and things we probably would talk about, um, but I really appreciate that, and that's why I have these conversations with people I admire because I learn so much, So with that being said, though, there still is a lot of people who would listen to this podcast or people that would say, man, like this church is just so showy or it's so loud, whether it's Pentecostalism or, even high church stuff or even, the religiosity of do this or else God's gonna, strike you with lightning. And they hear you talking about Josue this contemplative way, this way that is a movement out of love. The Spirit comes on us and we sit and listen because the Spirit is on us, not because we're trying to do a show or anything like that. Let's say someone is unfamiliar with this, but it sounds intriguing. All right,
Mm.
Tyler, we've heard you talk about your breath work and your meditation, and Josue is talking about finding this current that bubbles underneath the street, like Thurman, talked about. How would you coach somebody to start? Hey, this contemplative thing, I keep hearing about it. I keep hearing about mindfulness. I want to do it well. I want to do it in a good way, but all I know is screaming loud songs in a service. Or, how would somebody even start this path?
I would, it's interesting because the tension or the tension, the pull that some of us who are in this movement, let's call it, would say is like, go read Merton or go read Keating or go read Thurman or go read whoever, go read. I actually wouldn't do reading or anything yet. I would start with just creating kind of the way that I did. And I'm not saying it's because I did it because it worked for me, it's just because it's something that I actually think works. Creating a 2 minute, 3 minute, 5 minute pause in the middle of your day that you're not connecting to an internet, that you're not on your phone, that you're just connecting with either nature or music or just silent, that you're just there, or a time of conscious prayer where maybe it's just you. It could be spoken, could be not. I would start with just creating one moment, a little 5 minute. I actually have told people just a minute. Take a minute in the middle of your day to create space. Because I think once you create space in a minute, is going to expand out to 5 minutes, is going to expand out to more, and then might build out to different things. Now, that takes time. It took me years to have my own personal rule that what in my own personal rule before I was part of the community was two. I kind of naturally did two offices, two prayer times a day eventually. And I did two times of silence a day, kind of on my own. But it really started with a midday 3 minute. I think it was my reminder was a 5 minute reminder, but I don't think I ever did the full 5 minutes. It was 3 minute time that I just called it. What did I call it in my phone? I think I called it midday silence or
Yes.
something. And it was just 3 minutes of me sitting with either silence or in nature. I usually would pick somewhere outside if I could. Literally did nothing, did not look at my phone. I would look at my phone for the time, and eventually then I didn't. I That's how I would start. And then I would go into learning from people about it, because I think sometimes one of the things that the contemplative life does is that we are not contemplative life is not a head practice. It is in a way like there's a, okay, what is it? Am I making conscious contact with God? That is a head exercise. But it really is more of a heart practice, right? It's supposed to animate your heart. It's not so much like, let me learn it, figure it out, and I need to follow a prayer structure. Like even in high liturgy, I'm Episcopalian, right? When we do mass, or anything, right? There's a way that we do it. There's a book you follow that, and that's all you're going to do. That's not contemplative spirituality, right? What works for you may not necessarily work for me. We can guide you in something, but I would just start with a period of time, midday, 2 to 3 minutes, and just put a reminder on your phone or your watch or whatever, how it reminds you. Take a time of silence. Take a time just for yourself, and then just see how that felt.
Yep.
When I first started doing that for myself, Again, I was doing it because I was like, I need something to distance myself from my own constant thoughts, and that's really what did it. Now, I remember Henry Nouwen. I don't remember the book, but Henry Nouwen, very respected writer, and he said something in a book about when you create that space. And I love this metaphor. He said it's like a store in the middle of the road of a busy town. So the store is always open, so the people always come in and out. There's never a break for the store owner. And then at some point, the store owner decides, I need to create a break. So he closes the store every day at 12. And people then at first, they're going to come knocking at 12 because they've always expected the store to be open. So they're going to come knocking, knocking, knocking. But then after a while, they're like, oh, 12 is a break. I can't come at 12, so I'll come back at 1 or I'll come back at 2. And so then now he said it would take time. I remember reading it would take time, but then now the person created this thing. And I think that's how creating a contemplative moment works. It's not going to happen right away. It's probably going to take some time, but just holding that space every day for a while, even just the reminder. There were days when I would look at the reminder on my phone and then be like, I can't do it right now and put it away. And then I'll be like, but I need to do it. Let me go quickly do my 2, 3 minutes. It never ended up being 5 minutes. Eventually got to 5 minutes. Now, that might have taken like a year or two. But that creating that moment then created a space for me to know that this is the time that I'm taking for the thoughts to pause, for my busyness to pause. And then it did work kind of in the way that now and in this metaphor that he gave of the store owner, then that moment became a moment that then got longer, that then I didn't have to worry about, that I was looking forward to, that I just built into my rhythms, that then I was like, oh, I have that meeting. Oh, I can't do that meeting at that time. Can we do it 30 minutes later? Can we do it 20 minutes later or whatever? And I think that is the way that I would start. And then after trying that, then I would talk to people. I think for me, conversing with people, talking with you, for example, would be something helpful for someone who doesn't know. Talking with people who have a practice just to how they got, because I learned more from talking with people than from reading, like, do this thing. I would just ask people. Like I talked to the monks at the Benedictine monastery. I spoke to other contemplatives that I met while I was at monasteries, and they would tell me like, oh, do this, do that, do these things, or talk to people. Actually, sometimes people that I knew throughout New York City, and they would tell me, "Oh, this is what I do. I do it." And so, like, I built the time of gratitude because someone was like, "Well, I built a 5 minute gratitude at the end of the day." And I'm like, "Oh, I could do that. Just take time to give thanks for something at the end of the day. Easy." So I think those rhythms allow us to really build that. And I would just start with something simple, 2 to 3 minute period in which I'm taking a time for myself,
Mhm.
and then see where that how that leads you.
Yeah. I love, I mean, a couple things there. First of all, that reminds me so much of, and I think a lot of people have this quote, but I always give it to Roar, who says, you can't think yourself into new ways of living. You have to
Mm.
live yourself into new ways of thinking. And one of the metaphors I often use is like I run these ultra marathons and I run these really far races, and I didn't become a runner. Like I can't run 30. I didn't learn to run 30 miles by reading books about running 30 miles. If I just showed up to the race and said I've watched every documentary and read every book, I would not make it 30 miles. Now, I have read books and I have gotten coaches, I have done all of that, but mostly it was done by the practice, by
Yeah.
just trying to do it. We live ourselves into new ways of thinking. Um,
And that's what we call it practice, to be honest. I really honestly, I know you're going to ask something, but just real quick, I think that's what we call it a practice. So Lectio Divina is a practice. No one, I always feel, and Buddhists say this too, and other meditative spaces say this too, like no one ever masters the practice. Like you can, some people claim that they do. I actually think no one ever really masters it because every moment's so unique, but you practice it because that's what it is. It's just regular practice.
the other thing I love about this is that you live in Brooklyn, which by stereotype is the busiest storefront there is. There are people everywhere. There is noise. I mean, I live in Colorado and there's mountains and you know what I mean? And so I love like for you to endorse this, for you to say this must mean it works. You live in the belly of the beast, the beautiful beast that is the Northeast. Um, Tell me a little bit about finding silence in the midst of a city, a culture, a part of America in the world that hustles more than anywhere else, that has more people per capita than most places, that is chronically busy and loud. I know you've spoken to it, but I really want to make an emphasis on this. You've found this in a place where, in theory, it should be harder to find it culturally, environmentally, that sort of thing. What has that been like for you, being a New Yorker, being in Brooklyn, finding this contemplative space amidst such a busy and loud world?
Well, I mean, and you know, the moniker of New York City is the city that never sleeps. Like we literally have created an identity of not resting. Like it's like we don't rest. And all the songs that you hear about New York, it's always about how much you have to grind and you have to hustle and you have to make it. So there's this idea embedded within the memory of New York, embedded within the memory of Brooklyn of like, this is where you grind, is not where you go to do contemplation, right? You
Exactly.
do that in Colorado. You don't do that in,
Yeah.
in New York City. But I do remember that I actually developed my practice in the subway. So I've spoken to other city contemplatives, and a lot of us have done practice in the subway because New York also has the longest commute on average than any other city in the country.
Mhm.
So it's about 47 minutes, I think is what they said, is our average commute of a person, which
Wow.
is long. Most people in other places, I know when I've hung out with friends, they're like, oh, my commute is 20 minutes, 30 minutes. That's really long. I'm like, oh, that's long? My commute daily is an hour. My commute daily is like in New York, we always leave an hour to something because that's what's long is going to take you to get there. And I think you start
That's
to build
nuts. That is crazy.
that is the norm. I mean, that's why we have the longest on average commute in
Yeah.
the country.
Yeah, that's crazy. Anyway,
It's due to traffic. It's also due to the fact that the subway system, most people live in Brooklyn or Queens or the Bronx. Manhattan has a good number of people, but even if you go from uptown Manhattan to downtown Manhattan, that's going to take 20, 30 minutes.
yeah.
If you go from Brooklyn to Manhattan, unless you're right at the corner, at the early parts of Brooklyn, the downtown parts of Brooklyn, early parts, downtown parts of Brooklyn, it's a 10-minute ride, maybe 15-minute ride. Mostly everything else is going to be 30, 45 minutes. Queens, the same thing. Bronx, the same thing. So Staten Island, we don't even talk about. Staten Island also takes really long because they have a bridge, so they're their own little island. In New York, it's also four islands, three islands. It's a bunch of islands, right? Manhattan's an island, Staten Island's an island, Brooklyn and Queens are on Long Island. So therefore, you always have to cross a bridge. So only if you're in Bronx is the only part to the contiguous U.S. So you have to cross a bridge to get to Manhattan. So
Mhm.
there's always a bridge. So always some sort of bridge that you have to cross. Um, Anyway,
Yeah.
but you just create rhythms. Here's the one of the things I remember this conversation specifically with a monk at the Benedictine monastery because I was always feeling very centered there, and I would feel uncentered when I would go back into the city. And I told him this. I was like, "Hey, I'm not feeling centered when I go back." And so then I interpreted it as like maybe God is calling me to become a monk. I did try. I did apply to become a Benedictine monk.
Mhm.
They accepted me and they were like, you could be, but you have to decide if this is what you actually want to do, and all these questions that I had to think about. And I felt like that wasn't ultimately my calling. But during those conversations, one of the monk who was like in charge of making sure that I was okay, told me, he's like, well, if you can't engage in a meditation on your own in Times Square, you can't really do that. You should you then you can't really then you haven't developed, I forget the language he said, something like you haven't developed a contemplative life or something like that. So I saw that as a challenge, like, oh, I just got to create a meditation and just got to meditate in Times Square because that's the way that I interpreted that, like a challenge. And so then I was like, okay, someday I'm just going to go in Times Square and sit in the middle of Times Square, which, Times Square is always busy. I don't know if people are familiar with Times Square, but Times Square has all these lights. You've seen it on TV,
Yeah.
but Times Square is actually really like this. Thousands of people all of the time. There's never a break. There's actually never space, always crowded. And I was like, I'm going to go do that. And I went and did it. And I was like, okay. now what? But it wasn't what the monk was talking to me about, wasn't about going to do one meditation in Times Square. It was like creating a rhythm. So many people in the city, I've, because we take the subway to a lot of places, we will create rhythms in the subway. So my offices and all of that happen in the subway. So the subway, I might be standing really busy with like people coughing around me, drinking coffee, reading whatever, playing music. But I was like, oh, I'm going to take 20 minutes of this ride to be in silence, to do an office and to be in silence for the rest of it. And slowly, then it just became a habit that then I just could do it in the middle of the subway, taking the subway up to the Bronx, where when I remember when I was starting to develop these practices, was I was going from Brooklyn all the way to the Bronx, which is a 90-minute journey on not all the time, but some days is a 90-minute, it was a 90-minute journey. I'd have to get up really early, get ready, get going, and then the moment the subway is, I'm like, okay, great. We're gonna read this. We're gonna do that. And so you start to develop it. I think that like the metaphor that Nawan spoke about, it just creating the space. You could do it wherever. I think that sometimes we do get caught up in contemplative spaces, like, oh, it needs to be in the ideal situation, or it needs to be in the ideal setting. But the reality is that there's an ancient desert mother that I'm not remembering her name right now. I want to say Theodora, but many desert mothers were called Theodora. But she says, she's like, if you can't find silence in the middle of the storm, you're not going to be able to find silence anywhere, which I know is a metaphor. People use that a lot. But I'm thinking of like some of the desert mothers literally lived on a desert, lived on the wilderness. So they probably were like, how do I find some sort of silence in this middle of the storm, literal storm? And whenever they were able to find that, that's when they found their center. I think that in a city, the challenge is how do we make sure that we're creating intentional space for ourselves? And then also, how do we model that for people that we're with, right? So I'm not going around on the subway telling everyone to meditate with me. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just doing it for myself and then maybe sharing that news with other people who are around me. I don't know if you're probably familiar with this book, "The City Is My Monastery." The city is my it's a really important book. He talks about that, right? The way that I mean, he talks about an intentional community, a new monastic community in the middle of London, but he talks about the ways that they had to do rhythms and create different rhythms for themselves, and they eventually had to create a rule of life. And I think that's what helped a lot when I knew, like, okay, in my commute, I'm gonna go take 20 of those 45 minutes to do an office and some sort of silence. That started to create this rhythm that then I really always enjoyed. It's not just going to be consumed in listening to music. Not that music is bad, because sometimes actually music would be the way that I would lead into contemplation. So like that's actually one of the divinas that I started to develop, that I noticed like music led me to a moment of contemplation. Music always led me to a reflective moment, but not just music as consumer. Like let me just listen to whatever and just to kind of pass and to avoid other people. I also, the other practice I did, and I know I'm taking too long here, but I'll say that the other thing that I did, I read this, James Baldwin had this thing where he would go around the cities that he lived in. He lived in mostly Paris for a really long time, but he obviously grew up in New York, lived in New York. And he said he would go around the cities and just look at faces,
Mhm.
like just look at the way that people were looking and walking and being in the world. And I remember thinking that's a very contemplative exercise. How do I see people? And then what I added was let me pray for people as I'm looking at them. So it just became this practice that like I would just, and you notice in the subway, you notice all these faces. You don't have to stare weirdly at anyone. It's just you notice the way people are. And I think that started to create these rhythms for me to use commuting as a way to create this space for the rule. Yeah. I think
Yeah,
that's what.
no, that's so good. And there's another book too, by Ronald Rolheiser called The Domestic Monastery. And
Oh, that one I don't know.
he wrote that one mostly with like moms that would come to him and say, "Well, I would love to do this, but I'm
Mm.
not a monk or whatever." And he would always say like the kind of the way he talks about it, I'm pretty sure this was his term. He talks about like divine church bells and saying like, okay, you don't have church bells ringing in the middle of the city, but you do have the ding of a subway, for example. What if that was your call to prayer? Or what if
Mm.
the diaper change? was actually your call to prayer. So, a monastery is, and he really uses the metaphor of having kids. He's like, a monastery is leaving the world as you know it to go into an alternative way of living. And he's like, what else does that but like getting married? Like your whole,
Mm,
or having a kid. And if that's the case, when your life gets disrupted, then you use the natural things in your environment that happen on a rhythmic basis as a call to prayer.
that's so
So
good.
the
Yep.
subway ding, the whatever, if we let those just be the bell ringing at the monastery, then again we are in a domestic monastery. The city is my monastery. And so that book I get to pass out a lot to moms and parents who really are looking to cultivate exactly what you're talking about.
That's
Um,
really I didn't know that book, but that's really good because that is such just innovate. Like that's why I said earlier, we all have a rule of life. We all have ways that we have rhythms, and so it's just turning those into conscious rhythms, right? Kind of like what Brother Lawrence says, finding the presence of God in everything we're doing. So
I have something here to inspire our last little bit of talk, which is my Kendrick Lamar Saint Candle.
that's a good one. I've seen different ones. That's a good one though.
Isn't that a good one? Um, Tell me about hip hop. How does that integrate with all of this good work you do? You just barely hinted at it, and I want to go there. It'd be a crime if we didn't talk about Musica Divina, some of the work you're doing and listening to hip hop and finding these contemplative rhythms and finding God in um, I don't know. I think you were doing To Pimp a Butterfly. If what
We did
Cameron
a
said was,
song from To Pimp a Butterfly. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
we're gonna
yeah,
do others though. We're because it's a monthly practice now.
yeah.
So
So talk to me about hip hop, even just how it's formed you, how you're integrating it with contemplative practice, how that can help anybody in their own artistic passions and expressions. I don't want to get too specific. I'd love for you to just
no, yeah.
tell me all about it.
So let me just start by saying that I find hip hop to be a really contemplative music genre. I think all music is contemplative. Let me just say,
Mhm.
because I think the moment of creation requires an intentionality, a conscious contact. I think there's people who mass produce music. That's more of a new kind of phenomenon.
Yeah.
I think that traditionally music has always come from a very creative center, a really deep center. Even though there was always some regular, like, oh, I'm just gonna make this thing because I'm paid to do it. Most music is really creative, and I think comes from a contemplative center. For me, hip hop has is something obviously because I grew up in New York, I grew up in Brooklyn. Um, it's something that defines the city. Like hip hop began in New York, right? It began in the Bronx, and then what we always say is, most states or cities can talk about we have these five rappers that are really great. In New York, we're like we have each borough can say that. Every borough can be like we have five great rappers in this borough that are all time rappers. And so hip hop is just something that is a part of the city life, to be honest. And I remember growing up, you heard it everywhere. Of course, because I grew up Pentecostal in a kind of conservative Christian setting, you weren't allowed to listen to hip hop. So, so outwardly, I would never listen to hip hop, but I always bought bootleg tapes of this guy not so far from me. Like, if for those who are listening who grew up in the city, or wherever there was always a guy who sold bootleg versions of whatever you wanted. So like this movie, a bootleg version of that, which was like a bootleg is a fake version or recorded or whatever. Like it's not the original version. I don't know if people know the language of bootleg as much anymore, but so I remember always buying hip hop tapes from this guy because the tapes were cheaper than the CDs. Tapes were like $3 or $2. CDs were like $6. So I couldn't afford the CDs, so I would buy two tapes instead of one CD or whatever. And I remember just buying tapes and just liking hip hop and just listening to
Mm.
the rhythms and the lyrics. And I started to realize later in life that so that's how hip hop started. It began this thing. But now because of the Christian setting that I grew up, it was always like this thing that I hid. I hid hip hop. I never really wanted to talk about it because I was a minister so young. I had to perform in this way, and I couldn't say that I like hip hop. So I kept it to the side. No one would know it, but I would listen to hip hop always secretly on my own all the time. It wasn't until after the thing that I yada yada over the way that I left the Pentecostal church and all that stuff. That then I was like, hip hop is actually really spiritual. And I remember I was gravitating towards spiritual hip hop. Like, and I'm gonna say something that might be controversial. Not Christian hip hop specifically. I did like Christian hip hop. I listened to some Christian hip hop people. But Christian hip hop, eventually I started to hear the same kind of language that we hear in church of very personal responsibility and these things and oh world the world is so bad because we all failed to do this and only so then it started to become for me more evangelical hip hop that I was like I'm not trying to listen to that right now. But within hip hop naturally there's always been this deep spirituality, not again not Christian hip hop. I'm not saying anything wrong about it. I'm just saying that personally didn't speak to me, but traditional hip hop has always had a spiritual undercurrent there. So, like, for example, people who may know DMX's work is deeply spiritual. No one will consider it Christian. He himself wouldn't consider it Christian, but it was always deeply spiritual. Common's albums often are deeply spiritual. And so, like, there were a lot of places like that. One of my favorite albums, not one, my favorite album of all time is Mos Def and Talib Kweli or Black Star.
Hmm.
It's it's my favorite album of all time. I have it framed. I have two vinyls of it because I like to listen to it on vinyl. I listen to it regularly. I'll pop it back in. That's a deeply spiritual album. Whether or not people consider it Christian, it's not Christian, but it's spiritual. It is. And and um and so for me, that started to talk to me, and I started to then be less nervous about my association with hip hop in my conservative Christian setting because then I started to leave that setting. It's like y'all could go listen to Christian hip hop. Again, no disrespect to Christian hip hop rappers and people who love that. I was like, y'all could continue to do that. I'm gonna go listen over here because this really speaks to me. And so then over the last few years, as I've become more contemplative and more deeply entrenched in some practices that I really do, right? That are always with me, I realized that my way of listening to music was contemplative, like was also not just consumer. It's for things that I like. I can't, like I wrote this little piece called "Can Hip Hop Be Contemplative Form of Music?" And I say like you can't meditate to Wu-Tang's Enter the Wu-Tang 36 Chambers. You can't because that's a hard hitting, like DMX's Blood In, Blood Out. Can someone go listen to that? Sure. Meditatively, I wouldn't say no. Just the lyrics are too are there, but I would always go back to certain things and listen to it like, oh, I like this thing. Let me go listen to it again. What am I listening to here? And then I will slowly start to pepper them in my sermons, like, and I would always call them the great rapper, the great prophets of wherever. So the great prophet of Hempstead, Long Island, that's De La Soul. The great prophets from Queens, that's Tribe Called Quest. I'll be like, the prophets from Queens say this. And for me it's because they do hip hop artists I think do what the prophets do in a poetic way. Like they're like, hey, listen to this thing that's happening here. You may not hear it in that way, but let me show you my personal lived experience about whatever's happening over here. And that could be industry problems, that's usually societal problems. It could be all of these things. So for me, that really started to I just started to be more to own it more and to be more free to own that once I distance myself from the conservative Christian where I grew up, where that was like a real bad thing. It's still a bad thing.
Mhm.
And for me, hip hop creation is contemplative in that when people write lyrics, and I say that because not everyone writes lyrics. Some people, there's different methods in hip hop. Some people call it tapping in or checking in, which is when people go on a mic and just say whatever comes to mind, different than freestyle. There's freestyle and then there's because tapping in, you'll repeat a line, you keep repeating that and doing it a while. Anyway, a few people did that well. Jay-Z did it well. He's really the one who kind of invented it, or not invented it, but he's the one who made it best. Lil Wayne did it. All these people did it. And so there's less intentionality, I would say. But when people write, like you could just tell the difference because they're playing off all of these ideas. And they're sometimes reflecting back on a bunch of stuff. And I started to find that really intentional
Yeah.
and really beautiful. And I remember listening to Kendrick Lamar. Like early on, I remember getting on to Kendrick Lamar with Overly Dedicated, which was one of his first like mixtape that they released. And I was like, oh, there's something here. There's something here. And then he has a song in Section 80 called Cushion Corinthians, which I think is a really interesting dichotomy of what he's talking about in that song about religious life and regular street life. And I was like, there's something there that I'm understanding. And really, it wasn't until To Pimp a Butterfly which is my second favorite hip hop album of all time. So first is Black Star, most definitely Quality. Second is To Pimp a Butterfly. That I was like, oh, there's a lot of messages here. There's a deep understanding of religious tradition here. There's a deep understanding of spirituality here, and also the way that it plays out in the regular street life. I never lived street life as defined. Like we were always street adjacent though, right? We weren't. My parents were educated. My father was a pastor. My mom was a teacher. Like, so it wasn't. I was not in the street life at all. But we were street adjacent. That we had enough contact with that we knew what that's like. And so it just started to talk to me of a deeper spirituality that I started to really listen to. And then when you think of the way that DJs make beats, DJs, when they make a beat, that sometimes it's very intentional.
Yes.
Sometimes it's like, I'm going to make a beat. And sometimes it's like, no, I'm taking this snippet from this because I want to communicate this sound and this feeling in you. And I started to see hip hop as a very contemplative kind of expression, very spiritual expression of genre, even Christian hip hop, even if I don't regularly listen to it, there's an intentionality there that I found really strong and really beautiful. And so then that led, me to think about like just as in my regular practice, like how do I listen to hip hop contemplatively? And I noticed that I naturally would go back and listen to a song. Like I remember the album, Kendrick's album, since we're talking Kendrick's album, Damn. I remember listening to that album a bunch of times because I wanted to understand what some of the songs said. I remember the song Fear, listening to that song a long time. I remember to the song Feel, listening to that song a lot of times, and just being like, what is it saying here? There's a song that he has with U2 that people don't always love, but it's called Triple X on that album. That I was like, ooh, I need to listen to this song again. And that created this it created what I started to notice was kind of the way we do Lectio, right? When you do Lectio Divina, you read a text more than once, twice, maybe three times. And what is it that I'm hearing? And what is God telling me? When I did that this morning, that's what I did. I was like, oh, I need to read this Luke text that I was reading this morning. And so I started to notice that hip hop that I at least was listening to hip hop in that same way and to hear what the divine. And again, started inserting into sermons and then and it just became a way that I own because I realized I actually my life is very identified with hip hop, right? I remember watching Biggie's funeral on TV because day was a sad day for all of Brooklyn, and his casket paraded throughout Brooklyn and thousands of people lined the streets. Like if you ever watched the YouTube clip of that, I remember seeing that on TV. Like, wow, man, I can't believe that happened. I remember listening to Tribe Called Quest, like being very early on, well, not early on because I wouldn't know, but later understanding what they were talking about that moment and different moments, and it just started to be something that connected with me really deeply. And I think that then it's something that I realized leads me to a contemplative moment, right? The way that I listen to hip hop is not all the time. Sometimes I'm just like, I just need to play something because I want to play it, but sometimes I'm like, what is this song saying? And it just catches me by surprise. Sometimes it just catches me by surprise. Just recently, I was listening to this album, God Likes Ugly, God Does Like Ugly by JID or JID.
Mhm.
He has a song called Community, and it's a great song. It's a rap song. It's with the clips. People love that song because the clips are hot right now. Great. But I remember having to, ooh, what is he saying there? When he talks about in that song Community, especially JID's verse, is about hey, I'm not worried about all these little beefs or things that are happening because even in my neighborhood, the biggest guy could still get gunned down. And we're not talking about how the way that gun violence is affecting my community. Instead, we're focusing on these other things.
Yes.
And in there, he talks about the divine. In there, he talks about his spirituality. And that is what I like about hip hop, that it catches you like that. And then really makes you reflect on life and on lived experience and on the way that the divine. I think that if people take their prejudice away of like, oh, well, hip hop curses, okay, and hip hop has a misogynistic tend to it. No, I'm not gonna try to defend it. That's something very true. If you move away from those two things to be like, I don't want to listen to anything hip hop has to say, I think that you're missing a real important spirituality of regular people showing their lived experiences, right? And I think that lived experience is the way that we learn more from people. So for me, hip hop means a lot, and so we developed with Cameron, we developed this monthly practice called meditation is a must. Meditation is a must. It's a musica divina practice. Meditation is a must. The lyric comes from a Kendrick song, and this album that he has called Untitled Unmastered, which is Untitled '03, where he says like, "Oh, that's what I was told. Meditation is a must. It's something you got to try." And I just thought I remember with Cameron, I was like, "That's a good line," because that's what we're trying to encourage people here. But it's a way for us to listen to music. Right now, we're doing Kendrick Lamar. Eventually, we're going to do others because there's so many artists that do so many good things. And just what can we hear the divine telling us through the song? Is there something that it did? The first song we did was from To Pimp a Butterfly, was How Much a Dollar Costs. How Much a Dollar Costs is a song that talks about, is really a Matthew 25 metaphor. Like it's a way of, did you find the divine? The story is Kendrick Lamar's in South Africa. A guy asked him for a few rand. 10 rand is like less than a dollar, or about a dollar or $2. And he's like, "No, I'm not going to give you any money. I don't want to do that. Everything I earned was mine." And before he leaves, the homeless guy tells him, "Like, well, you just missed your blessing because I'm God, I'm the divine." And then Kendrick in the next song shows that why that was an issue and how that led him to other realization. Anyway, we did that song as a way to, how do we see the divine in others? Because I remember when I first listened to that song, that's what I left me with. Like, do I see the divine in the homeless person that I see? And New York, Brooklyn, we have a lot. I see homeless people all the time. Do I see the divine, or do I see them as nuisances that should be gone? Do I see that? And that started to create. And so I think hip hop creates this deep way to look at the world in a different way, because it's not our own lens, right? It's not my own lens. Even though I'm a black person in this country, I'm a black person in the world, not only in this country, but even though I'm a black person, that's not my experience. Compton is not my experience. Even Mos Def, who's from Brooklyn, he's talking about a different part of Brooklyn, a different hood, a different time. I didn't grow up in that, but seeing life through that experience then lets me learn and seeing like, oh, how do I see the divine in that? Killer Mike has this line in this song called Jeopardy. Killer Mike is a rapper from Atlanta. He's part of a group called Run the Jewels. And in a song called Jeopardy, he says this deep line that left me, I think about it all the time. He's like, I might be the only representation of God you might see, in this line that he's talking about a bunch of things. And I'm like, how do I act if I am the only representation of God people see every day? And that line made me think about that equally as much as the scripture would make me think about it. And that I remember that line so well, because I remember that after that album dropped, I preached it on Sunday. And someone was like, I can't believe you quoted a rapper. But not in a bad way. They were like, I'm glad you quoted a rapper.
Yeah.
And they didn't know who Killer Mike was. And yeah, so I just think hip hop offers a lot of ways for us to really think about our lives and the way we're living in the world. And many rappers do that in hip hop history, old school rappers, new school rappers. I think there's a really diversity there. But I think all music can do it. I was meditating with these Carmelite monks in Oxford, England, and the way they went into meditation through Ed Sheeran. That they were listening to Ed Sheeran at the beginning of their meditation, and that's what led them to the meditation. And I spoke to one of them. I was like, afterwards, like, why Ed Sheeran? He's like, I just find that music soothes me and it leads us there. And now all of us are led. So the time of meditation began with listening to Shapes of You by Ed Sheeran. I think that's the song. And then going straight into silence. I thought that was beautiful. And I think you can find that with any musical genre.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I've grown to really appreciate hip hop. I didn't grow up knowing much about it for just a couple reasons. One, was the whole Christian thing. For two, I grew up, it's so funny you said you grew up adjacent to kind of like those that community, like street life. I always said I grew up punk adjacent. Like I grew up in a
Mm,
small mountain town, but I was always drawn to punk. So, dude, so much of our story is similar in that I would have to hide punk music and stuff because the Mohawks and the whatever. Um, and long story short, I opened a coffee company, and our chef, this big black dude, just handsome as hell, loved hip hop, and he couldn't believe what I didn't know. And so every week he would give me an assignment, a hip hop assignment. And so for like 3 years, Jacob Cheatham is his name, and I just am so thankful. But he taught me so much about hip hop. But what was crazy, Josue, was I started realizing this is pretty much punk, or maybe punk is
Hmm.
hip hop. And I
There are a
started,
lot of connections.
and it's like, and even New York, I mean, CBGB is like one of the most iconic punk venues of all time. And, I mean, and you think like the Beastie Boys, and and even like Bad Brains, one of the first hardcore punk bands, like punk is generally white, but like Bad Brains was the first and they were, and then I mean it was a black band. And then they turned kind of more reggae and would rap a little bit, but more than anything, I think both of the genres pay attention. And I think for
Mm,
me the difference is
mm,
is like there's music that asks me to pay attention. And I think hip hop does this a lot. I think punk does this a lot. Look at this, look at you, versus music that just tells you what to think.
mhm.
And I think, there was like the Christian versions of all of this stuff just tells you what to think. This is what's happening. This is why it's good or bad, versus saying, have you noticed this? Have you paid attention to that? And I think that's what makes these things so contemplative. They ask us to think.
Yep.
And yeah, and so anyways, I love, man, like I mean, so yeah, I'm much more punk at heart, but as I've been introduced to hip hop over the last maybe 7 or 8 years, it's like it's pretty much I would love a documentary that could like sort of intertwine it and the cultures of it because I think it does the same thing in so many ways.
I mean, and I think you just mentioned reggae. And
Hmm.
so all three genres, punk,
Hmm.
reggae, hip hop, come from working class people,
Yes.
dominantly working class people,
Yes.
dominantly anti-empire people who
Yes.
are like, I realize that this thing is messing me up. I remember that Bob Marley said that he went to a punk show in England and he noticed that they were being persecuted as much. He was shocked
Hmm.
that how that the police were persecuting the punk people the same way that he got persecuted in Jamaica. He
Uh-huh.
was like, "Oh, so clearly this is a global thing, and maybe I need to tap into that." And one of the people who became his guitarist was actually a punk guitarist who eventually became the guitarist for the Wailers. I don't remember his name right now. I
Interesting.
know they tell his story briefly in the movie that came out,
Uh-huh.
but he was a punk guy. He was a black punk guitarist who was like, "Hey, go play with this reggae guy," and it's because those musics comes from the same place. I think they come from lived experience, right? Like Frantz Fanon to define blackness says that blackness, the essence of blackness is the lived experience of the black person.
Hmm.
And so if you extrapolate that to anything, the spiritual life is the lived experience of the people, right? So punk speaks from regular lived experience, not polished. That's what was called punk. It's not polished. It wasn't industry created. Hip hop was not industry created. Now that there are industry versions of those things now that then have changed the message and turned it into whatever, yes. But that there's still artists that still do that 100%, right? The same thing happened with reggae. There's some regular whatever reggae that is whatever, but then there's some reggae that's still very revolutionary, very of the people. And I think that's what you're talking about, right? This idea of of hearing lived experience and then having learning from that lived experience. And that lived experience often is very deeply reflective and spiritual,
Yes.
which I think then leads us to contemplative. So I actually I don't listen to punk regularly, but I listen to punk,
Yeah.
and I'm like, there's so many parallels with like the way that they're talking. Hey, here's my struggle. My
Yes.
struggles is this, and here's the way that And so I find a lot of strength in that, and I think that is the thing that Beastie Boys was kind of doing, combining both these worlds, right? Like they were deeply steeped in hip hop, but they were also deeply adjacent to punk, and we're like, we're gonna play that off. So
Yep.
yeah.
It's so good. I want to keep going so much, and there's going to be a part two someday. You don't have a choice. I'm going to make it happen.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you so much.
I want to wrap up with just two quick things. We won't take it too long. I want to really honor your time. First of all, where can people find you, find your work? How can they get connected with all of the beautiful stuff you're about? And I'll read your bio in the intro later, and it'll all be linked. But if you were to point people towards anything, what would you point them toward, Josue?
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I'm leading right now is this project called Black Lives in Contemplation. What Black Lives in Contemplation seeks to do is to center Black experience and Black wisdom to help us get into contemplative experience. So it's not like uh, it's just a way to center it, because I think you and I know this because we've been in contemplative circles. Contemplative circles tend to be not very diverse, not only racially and ethnically diverse, that's sure, but also there's not a lot of men in these spaces. There's not a lot of young people, younger people. Sometimes I might be in a monastery and I might be the only non plus 60 white woman in the room. Like literally
100%.
it's just that. And I'm the only person that's not that. And and the only reason why I say that is because one of the things that we want to do is to start to help diversify contemplative spaces. So having a conversation like this with your audience, with your listeners that who probably are of a different demographic than that, maybe the same, maybe different. It's great because I think that we need to start to diversify who is contemplative and how we identify that. So what I would say is go to spiritualimagination.org/BLC to learn about some of the things that we're doing. The community overall at spiritualimagination.org. If you want to follow me personally, I guess you could follow my Instagram, which is Gessner, my first name, which is a complicated German Welsh name. It's a long story how I got that name, but Gessner, Guesnerth, because I point back to all those things. But those are the things that I would point us to, because I think what we're trying to do is make sure that people are learning how to have different ways to open themselves up to contemplative experience. So we'll do Musica Divina, right? The Kendrick Lamar meditation, which is going to start monthly on the third Thursday of every month. You can find information on that. We're going to have some in-person things throughout New York City. We also have some classes that we offer so that if you want to learn more about contemplation in different ways, like the socially engaged mysticism class, there's another class that we teach called Black Lives in Contemplation, just like how is it that Black life has always been contemplative. These are ways that what the hope is that open up different people's interest and piques their interest on contemplative life. So just go to spiritualimagination.org/BLC, or my personal Instagram, Gessnerth, Guesnerth, or on Instagram, Spiritual Imagination. And that's the one way to find us.
I love it. Last but definitely not least, the most important part here, Josue, one of the things in just my work is wanting people to remember how beloved they are.
Hmm.
And that when we can start and live our lives from a place of deep belovedness, so much really begins to flourish. Josue, would you be willing to share with us a few things that you love about you? It's a
Hmm.
practice I work with a lot of my clients. And what I'm trying to do is show the people what it's like to love one's self. And so, as we wrap up, would you be willing to engage in that practice with me for a minute and just share a handful of things that you love about yourself?
Sure. Hmm. I would say that I love about myself. I'm going to use the word love. I love um, the way that I can hold different ideas and different opinions and tension. Um, I think another thing that I love is the way that I've become more expansive in my understanding of a lot of things. I'm not so tethered to just one way of looking at some stuff. Um, and I've come to really be enriched by that, by being able, because that allows me to. The third thing that I was going to say is I really love that I'm curious.
Mhm.
Um, I'm sure you're familiar with the show Ted Lasso, and Ted Lasso has that episode where he's like, you didn't know who I was because you weren't curious, and curiosity really helps us. And I remember watching that and really speaking to me and really being like, how can I become more curious? See, there's a cinema divina, right? Like watching a show and being like, what can it? But I remember thinking like, how can I become more curious? and not so certain, because I think sometimes we tend to become certain the longer we do things. We're like, oh, I know how this is going to turn out. And sure, some things go that way, but I think becoming more curious opens up ourselves for wonder. And I've become lately, I really love that I'm much more and more curious, and have been surprised by wonder. And the last thing is that I love that I'm able um, to have committed to some of these practices. Really, there was sometimes when I was talking about them aspirationally,
Mhm.
but over the past few years, it's really part of my identity, and and I love that. So yeah, this was I was trying to say love and not just I appreciate or I think that, but I really appreciate this exercise of what do I love about myself.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Josue, I am buzzing having had this opportunity to have met you and to be in this conversation, and I just can't wait to get to know you more. And I make it that way about once a year, so I'll take you out to. You can take me to one of your spots, and I've got some spots too out there that I love. So we'll make it happen, bro. Thank you again for just. I feel so lucky to have met you today, and thanks for being a guest here.
Oh, thank you so much, Tyler. And yeah, when I come out to Denver or somewhere near you, glad to
Cool.
connect. And this was really a blessing, actually. That practice really just woke something in me right now to love myself in that way. So thank you so much for that practice.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right.